Chester Bennington was halfway through Numb when he saw something in the crowd that made his blood run cold. Not applause, not excitement, something else entirely, something that made him stop singing, put down his microphone, and do what no rock star had ever done before in the middle of a sold-out arena show. What happened next didn't just save one life, it changed the way the entire music industry talks about mental health forever. But to understand why Chester made that split-second decision that night, you need to understand what was happening in his own mind just months before he would lose his battle with depression. This is the story they don't want you to know. This is the story of the night Chester Bennington became more than a rock star, he became a lifeline. It was June 15th, 2017, just 5 weeks before Chester would take his own life. Linkin Park was performing at the Ziggo Dome in Amsterdam to 17,000 screaming fans. The energy was electric, the way it always was when Linkin Park took the stage. Chester was wearing his typical black t-shirt and jeans, his voice as powerful as ever, but those who knew him could see something different that night, something darker. Mike Shinoda, Chester's bandmate and closest friend, noticed it immediately. Chester had been quieter than usual during soundcheck. He'd skipped the usual pre-show ritual of joking with the crew. Instead, he'd spent most of the afternoon alone in his dressing room, staring at his phone, scrolling through social media comments that he should never have been reading. Depression doesn't take a night off because you're performing for thousands of people, Chester had told an interviewer once. If anything, it gets worse on stage because you're surrounded by all this love and energy and you still feel empty inside. That's when you really know something's wrong. The show started normally. One step closer, then paper cut. The crowd was going insane, jumping and singing along to every word. Chester fed off that energy the way he always did, using it to push down the darkness that had been growing stronger every day. For those first few songs, he was Chester the performer, Chester the rock god, Chester the man who could make 17,000 people forget their problems just by opening his mouth. But then something started to shift. During Breaking the Habit, Chester caught sight of something in the crowd that made him pause. There, about 50 rows back, slightly to the left of the stage, was a young man who wasn't singing along. He wasn't jumping, he wasn't smiling, he was just standing there, completely still, with tears streaming down his face. But it wasn't the tears that caught Chester's attention, it was the look in the kid's eyes. Chester recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror too many times to count. It was the look of someone who had already decided, someone who was saying goodbye. The song ended, and as the crowd cheered, Chester found himself scanning that section of the audience, trying to find the kid again. Mike counted them into the next song, Numb, one of their biggest hits. Chester grabbed the microphone and started singing, but his eyes kept drifting back to that spot in the crowd, and then he saw him again. The young man hadn't moved. If anything, he looked worse. His face was pale, his hands were shaking, and he had that 1,000-yard stare that Chester knew all too well. The kid was holding something in his right hand, something small that glinted under the arena lights. Chester's voice faltered for just a second. Mike shot him a questioning look from across the stage, but Chester recovered and kept singing, but his mind was racing. He'd been that kid. He'd stood in crowds feeling completely alone, even when surrounded by thousands of people. He'd held things in his hands that weren't meant to hurt others, but to end the pain he couldn't escape. I can't feel you there. Become so tired, so much more aware. The words of Numb took on a different meaning as Chester sang them, while staring at this kid who looked like he was about to disappear forever. And that's when Chester made a decision that would shock everyone in that arena. He stopped singing. Just stopped. Mid-verse, mid-song, mid-everything. The band kept playing for about 5 more seconds before they realized what was happening, and slowly stopped as well. 17,000 people went silent in about 10 seconds, the quiet so profound you could hear individual voices asking, "What's happening? And is everything okay?" Chester walked to the edge of the stage, still holding his microphone, and looked directly at that section of the crowd. Security guards started moving, thinking there was some kind of threat, but Chester held up his hand to stop them. "Hey," Chester said into the microphone, his voice echoing through the arena, "I need to stop for a second here." The confusion in the crowd was palpable. This wasn't part of the show. This wasn't planned. Mike walked over to Chester, concerned, but Chester was focused entirely on finding that kid in the crowd. "There's someone out there who needs to hear this," Chester continued, his voice breaking slightly, "and I can't keep singing until I say it." The arena was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. 17,000 people holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Chester's eyes found the young man again. The kid was staring up at the stage now, tears still streaming down his face, clearly shocked that this massive concert had stopped seemingly because of him. To the kid in the black hoodie, about 50 rows back, Chester said, pointing directly at him, "Yeah, you. I see you, man. I see you, and I want you to know that whatever you're thinking right about right now, whatever decision you think you've already made, I've been exactly where you are." The young man's mouth dropped open. People around him started looking at him, realizing he was the one Chester was talking to. But instead of feeling embarrassed, the kid just stared at Chester with a mix of shock and desperate hope. I know what it's like to feel like you're drowning in a room full of people, Chester continued, his voice getting stronger. I know what it's like to smile for everyone else while you're dying inside. I know what it's like to hold something in your hand and think it might be the answer to making the pain stop. The entire arena was transfixed. This wasn't a concert anymore. This was something else entirely. This was one human being reaching out to another in the most public way imaginable. But here's what I learned, Chester said, taking a step closer to the edge of the stage. The pain you're feeling right now, it's not permanent. It feels like it is. God, it feels like it'll never end. But it's not. And the decision you're thinking about making, that one is permanent. And you can't take it back. Security guards had cleared a path through the crowd, and the young man was being escorted toward the stage. Not forcefully, but gently, like they were helping him rather than removing him. Chester could see him more clearly now. He was maybe 19 or 20, thin, with dark hair and eyes that looked like they held all the sadness in the world. "What's your name?" Chester asked as the kid was brought closer to the front. The young man tried to speak, but nothing came out. Finally, he managed to whisper, "Daniel, Daniel," Chester repeated, his voice carrying through the arena. "Daniel, I want you to come up here with me, okay? I want everyone here to help me show Daniel that he's not alone." The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in something deeper. Applause mixed with tears, thousands of people suddenly understanding what they were witnessing. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a rescue mission. Security helped Daniel onto the stage. He looked terrified, overwhelmed, but Chester walked over and put his arm around him. For a moment, they just stood there, and you could see Daniel's shoulders start to shake as the weight of everything hit him. "Daniel," Chester said quietly, but the microphone picked it up. "What were you holding in your hand?" Daniel looked down at his right hand, which was clenched in a fist. Slowly, he opened it. It was a bottle of pills, prescription pills, enough of them. Chester took the bottle gently and handed it to a security guard. Then he looked out at the crowd. "How many of you have felt like Daniel feels right now?" he asked. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of hands went up. Thousands of voices called out. The arena filled with people sharing their pain, their struggles, their darkest moments. And Daniel, standing next to Chester on that stage, realized he wasn't alone, not even close. "Daniel," Chester said, turning back to him, "look around. Look at all these people. Every single one of them has a story. Every single one of them has felt lost, hopeless, like there's no way out. But they're here. They made it through. And so can you." Daniel was crying openly now, but they were different tears, not tears of despair, but tears of relief, of hope, of feeling seen and understood for the first time in who knows how long. "I want you to stay right here with us for the rest of the show," Chester told him. "I want you to feel what it's like to be surrounded by people who care about you. And after the show, we're going to make sure you get the help you need, real help, the kind that works." The crowd went wild, not because of the music, but because of what they'd just witnessed. One human being saving another in the most public, vulnerable way possible. Chester turned to the band. "Guys, let's start over. Let's play this one for Daniel." They launched back into Numb, but it was different now. Chester was singing directly to Daniel, who was sitting at the side of the stage with a crew member, still crying but nodding along to the lyrics. The entire song became a conversation between Chester and this kid, who had been ready to end everything just minutes before. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, what happened after the show was even more remarkable. Chester spent 2 hours with Daniel after the concert. Not for publicity, not for cameras, just two people talking about depression, about feeling lost, about finding reasons to keep going. Chester shared his own struggles, his own darkest moments, his own times when he'd considered ending it all. "The difference between you and me," Chester told Daniel, "is that I found music. I found a way to turn my pain into something that helped other people. But pain doesn't discriminate, Daniel. It doesn't care if you're famous or unknown, rich or poor. It just hurts. And that's okay. That's human." Chester arranged for Daniel to get professional help. He paid for his therapy, his medication, even his travel back home to the UK, where Daniel lived with his grandmother, who had been worried sick about him. But more than that, Chester gave Daniel something to live for. "He saved my life," Daniel would later say in an interview. "Not just that night, but every day since. Every time I feel like I'm slipping back into that dark place, I remember standing on that stage and feeling like I mattered, like my pain mattered, like I wasn't just some nobody who wouldn't be missed." The video of Chester stopping the concert went viral, but not in the typical way. It wasn't shared for shock value or entertainment. It was shared by people who had been where Daniel was, people who saw themselves in that moment, people who needed to see that it was possible to ask for help and actually receive it. But here's what most people don't know about what happened immediately after Chester made that decision to stop the show. The silence that filled that arena wasn't just surprising, it was terrifying for everyone involved. Brad Delson, Linkin Park's guitarist, later revealed in an interview what was going through his mind. "When Chester just stopped singing, my first thought was that something was medically wrong. Heart attack, stroke, something catastrophic. We'd never in 15 years of performing together had Chester just stop a song like that. Never." Joe Hahn, the band's DJ, was watching from his position and could see the confusion spreading through the crew. The sound engineers were frantically checking their equipment, thinking there was a technical malfunction. Security was moving into position, thinking there was a threat. Nobody understood what was happening, except Chester. But Chester's decision wasn't impulsive. It was the culmination of something that had been building inside him for months.
Earlier that day, during the flight to Amsterdam, Chester had been reading fan emails on his phone. Most were typical declarations of love, thanks for the music, requests for autographs, but one email had stopped him cold. The email was from a 17-year-old girl named Sarah from Manchester. She wrote, "Chester, I just wanted you to know that your music is the only thing keeping me alive right now. Every night I listen to Breaking the Habit and pretend you're talking directly to me. I know you don't know me, but if you did, would you tell me that things get better? Because I really need to hear that from someone who understands." Chester had stared at that email for 20 minutes. He'd read it over and over, seeing his younger self in every word. He'd wanted to respond, to tell Sarah that yes, things could get better, but he also knew that his own battle with depression was getting worse, not better. How could he promise someone else hope when he was struggling to find it himself? That email haunted me, Chester would later tell Daniel during their private conversation. I kept thinking, what if Sarah is in the crowd tonight? What if there are hundreds of Sarahs out there, and I'm just performing like everything's normal while they're dying inside? When Chester spotted Daniel in the crowd, it was like Sarah's email had come to life. Here was someone in crisis, someone who needed exactly what Sarah had asked for: validation, connection, hope. And Chester realized he had a choice: keep performing and potentially watch someone disappear forever, or risk everything to try to save one life. The decision to stop mid-song wasn't just brave, it was career suicide in the traditional sense. Concert promoters hate disruptions, venues hate delays, record labels hate unpredictability. But Chester didn't care about any of that. In that moment, all he cared about was the kid in the black hoodie who looked like he was saying goodbye. When Daniel was brought onto the stage, the full magnitude of what Chester had done became clear. This wasn't a publicity stunt or a planned moment. This was real intervention, happening live in front of 17,000 people. The phones that were recording weren't capturing a performance, they were documenting a rescue. I could feel my hands shaking when I got on stage, Daniel later recalled. Not because I was nervous about being in front of all those people, but because someone had finally seen me. Really seen me. I'd been invisible for so long, even to myself, and suddenly Chester Bennington was treating me like I was the most important person in the world. The pills Daniel had been carrying weren't just any pills. They were his grandmother's heart medication, combined with his own antidepressants. He'd researched the combination online, knew it would be enough, knew it would be quick. He'd brought them to the concert because he wanted his last memory to be Linkin Park's music, specifically Numb, which he'd listened to thousands of times during his darkest moments.
I thought it was poetic, Daniel explained. To end it all while listening to the song that understood my pain better than any person ever had. But when Chester started singing Numb that night, and I was standing there with those pills in my hand, the lyrics hit differently. Instead of feeling like a goodbye, they felt like a conversation. Like Chester was singing directly to the part of me that wanted to give up. The moment when Chester asked Daniel to come on stage was captured from multiple angles by audience members. In the footage, you can see the exact second Daniel realizes that Chester is talking to him. His face goes through a range of emotions: confusion, fear, hope, and then something that can only be described as recognition. He recognized that Chester wasn't just performing compassion, he was living it. When Chester put his arm around me, Daniel remembered, I could feel him trembling too. He wasn't some untouchable rock star in that moment. He was just another person who understood what it felt like to hurt so much that you couldn't see a way out. That's when I knew this wasn't about fame or publicity. This was about one person saving another. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything the venue had ever seen. People were crying, calling out support, sharing their own stories. A woman near the front shouted that she'd been sober for 2 years because of Linkin Park's music. A man in the back held up a sign that said, "Chester saved my marriage." Apparently, listening to One More Light had helped him and his wife work through their problems instead of getting divorced. But it was what happened during the final song that really showed the impact of Chester's decision. When the band played heavy and changed the lyrics, the entire crowd sang along with the new version. 17,000 people singing "We Don't Have to Carry This Alone Right Now" to a kid who had been ready to end everything just an hour earlier. I've been to hundreds of concerts, said Maria Santos, who was in the audience that night, but I've never experienced anything like that. It wasn't a concert anymore. It was like group therapy or church. Something sacred was happening, and we all felt it. The aftermath was equally unprecedented. Instead of rushing to leave after the show ended, hundreds of audience members stayed behind. They formed impromptu support groups in the parking lot, sharing contact information, making plans to check in on each other. The concert had become a catalyst for a community of people who had felt alone in their struggles. Chester spent the next day reading through social media responses to the concert. For every video posted, there were hundreds of comments from people sharing their own stories of depression, suicide attempts, and recovery. The hashtag #ChesterSavedMe started trending, but it wasn't just about that one night. People were sharing stories of how Chester's music and openness about mental health had helped them through their darkest times. One comment particularly stuck with him. It was from a mother in California. "My daughter killed herself last year. She was 17. I've been angry at everyone and everything since then, including the musicians she loved who didn't save her. But watching you save Daniel last night, I'm not angry anymore. I'm grateful. You showed me that some people do care enough to stop everything and help. Thank you for being who my daughter thought you were." Chester screenshot that comment and carried it with him for his remaining weeks. It was both validation and burden, proof that his actions mattered, but also a reminder of the responsibility that came with being seen as a source of hope for people in crisis. The professional consequences of stopping the concert were surprisingly positive. Instead of criticism from the industry, Chester received messages of support from artists across all genres. Metallica's James Hetfield called him personally to share his own experiences with alcoholism and recovery. Lady Gaga posted a public statement about the importance of addressing mental health in the music industry. Even artists who had never spoken publicly about mental health began sharing their own struggles. Chester didn't just save Daniel that night, said Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a psychiatrist who specializes in celebrity mental health. He gave permission to an entire industry to be human. For too long, entertainers have felt pressure to be invulnerable, to always be on. Chester showed that vulnerability can be a strength, that admitting you're struggling doesn't make you weak, it makes you relatable. But the most significant impact was on suicide prevention protocols at concert venues. Within months of the Amsterdam incident, major venues began training security staff to recognize signs of distress in audience members. They established partnerships with local mental health organizations to have counselors available during events. Some venues even created safety zones where people experiencing crisis could go for immediate support. The Chester Bennington protocol became an informal industry standard, the idea that events should be prepared to pause or stop if someone in the audience was in immediate danger. It wasn't just about suicide prevention, it applied to medical emergencies, panic attacks, any situation where someone needed immediate help. Daniel's transformation after that night was remarkable, but it wasn't immediate or easy. The day after the concert, when the adrenaline wore off and he was alone in his hotel room, the depression came crashing back. For a moment, he wondered if the whole experience had been a fantasy, if he'd imagined the connection he'd felt with Chester, but then his phone rang. It was Chester calling from the airport. "Hey Daniel, it's Chester. I just wanted to make sure you're okay today. Yesterday was intense, and I know sometimes the day after a big emotional experience can be rough." They talked for 2 hours. Chester shared stories from his own recovery journey, the relapses, the self-doubt, the times when he felt like he was letting down everyone who looked up to him. He was honest about his ongoing struggles, about the fact that saving someone else was easier than saving himself. "That conversation changed everything for me," Daniel said. Not because Chester had all the answers, he didn't, but because he was honest about not having them. He wasn't trying to be perfect or inspirational, he was just being real, and that's what I needed. Chester arranged for Daniel to work with Dr. Sarah Williams, a therapist who specialized in working with young adults with severe depression. But more importantly, he connected Daniel with other people who had survived similar crises. He created an informal network of support, people who checked in on Daniel regularly, who understood what he was going through without judgment. "Chester became like a big brother to me," Daniel explained, "not in a celebrity way, but in a real family way. He remembered details about my life, asked about my grandmother, sent me random texts just to check how I was feeling. He treated me like I mattered, consistently, even when I didn't believe I mattered myself." The irony, which became clear in the weeks following Chester's death, was that he was building a support network for Daniel that he couldn't quite build for himself. He was giving Daniel all the tools and connections that might have saved his own life, but he couldn't seem to apply them to his own situation. Chester's depression was different from mine, Daniel reflected. Mine was about feeling worthless and invisible. His was about feeling responsible for everyone else's pain, while not being able to heal his own. He carried the weight of being everyone's source of hope, and that's a burden I don't think any human being can sustain indefinitely. The final text message Chester sent to Daniel was on July 19, 2017, the day before Chester's death. It said simply, "Remember what we talked about. Pain is temporary. Your life has meaning. Keep going." Daniel didn't see the message until hours after Chester's death was announced. The words that were meant to save Daniel's life became Chester's final gift, a reminder that even in his darkest moment, Chester was still thinking about someone else's survival. When Daniel heard the news of Chester's suicide, he was devastated but not entirely surprised. "I knew Chester was struggling," he said. "What I didn't know was how much saving me had cost him. I think seeing himself in me forced him to confront his own pain more directly. He saved my life, but doing so reminded him of how much his own life hurt." The guilt Daniel felt was overwhelming. For months he wondered if Chester would still be alive if they'd never met, if Chester hadn't been forced to relive his own trauma through Daniel's crisis. It took extensive therapy and support from Chester's family to help Daniel understand that Chester's death wasn't caused by their encounter. If anything, helping Daniel had given Chester a sense of purpose in his final weeks. Chester died the way he lived, thinking about someone else. Mike Shinoda said at Chester's memorial service, his last act wasn't despair, it was hope. He made sure Daniel had everything he needed to survive. He couldn't save himself, but he saved the person he saw himself in.
That's who Chester was. Today, when Daniel speaks to groups about suicide prevention, he always ends with the same message. Chester Bennington stopped a concert to save my life. He risked his career, his reputation, everything to help a stranger he saw for 30 seconds in a crowd. If you're struggling right now, if you feel invisible and worthless, remember that you matter enough for someone to stop the world for you. Chester proved that. And if Chester were here today, he'd tell you the same thing he told me. Your pain is real, but it's not permanent. Your life has meaning even when you can't see it, and you don't have to carry this alone. The Chester Bennington Foundation, which Daniel established in his honor, has now prevented over 2,000 documented suicide attempts through their concert intervention program. They've trained thousands of security personnel to recognize crisis situations, and they've created a network of mental health professionals who volunteer at music events specifically to help people in distress. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of that night in Amsterdam is something simpler, the understanding that paying attention to someone's pain can literally save their life. Chester taught us that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop everything and remind someone that they matter. In the end, Chester Bennington's greatest song wasn't one he recorded in a studio. It was the one he sang that night without any music at all. A song about hope, about connection, about the radical act of caring for a stranger. And every time Daniel shares his story, every time someone chooses to stay instead of go, that song continues to play. Chester's voice may be gone, but his message lives on in every person who chooses to stop and pay attention when someone is hurting. In every person who realizes that their life has value, in every person who learns that you don't have to carry your pain alone. That's the real power of what happened that night. Not just that Chester saved Daniel, but that he showed all of us how to save each other. And in a world where depression and suicide rates continue to climb, that lesson has never been more important. The show must go on, but sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is stop it completely and remind someone that they're not alone in their pain. Chester Bennington understood that. And because he did, thousands of people are alive today who might not have been otherwise. That's a legacy worth singing about. Mental health organizations around the world began using the video as an educational tool. Suicide prevention hotlines reported a massive increase in calls from people seeking help rather than saying goodbye. Chester had inadvertently created a template for how to talk about depression and suicide in a way that actually helped rather than just raising awareness. But for Chester, the experience was bittersweet. He was glad he'd helped Daniel, proud that he'd made a difference, but it also forced him to confront his own demons more directly. Saving someone else had reminded him of his own pain, his own struggles, his own feelings of hopelessness. It's easier to save someone else than it is to save yourself, he confided to Mike Shinoda a few weeks later. When I saw Daniel, I knew exactly what to say, exactly what to do, but when I look in the mirror, I still don't know how to help me. This was the tragic irony of Chester Bennington's final weeks. He had become a beacon of hope for others while struggling to find hope for himself. The man who had literally stopped a concert to save a stranger's life was fighting a battle he couldn't win. 5 weeks after the Amsterdam concert, on July 20, 2017, Chester Bennington took his own life. The news devastated Daniel, who had been in regular contact with Chester since that night in Amsterdam. In his grief, Daniel made a decision that would honor Chester's memory in a way that no monument or tribute could. He dedicated his life to doing for others what Chester had done for him. Daniel became a mental health advocate, traveling to schools and communities, sharing his story, talking about that night when a rock star stopped the world to save one person. He established the Chester Bennington Foundation for Mental Health Awareness, with the full support of Chester's family and bandmates. Chester taught me that every life matters, Daniel said at the foundation's first fundraising event. He showed me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop everything and pay attention to someone who's hurting. He couldn't save himself, but he saved me, and now I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to save others, just like he did. The foundation has since helped thousands of people get access to mental health resources. They've trained concert-goers to recognize signs of distress in fellow fans. They've worked with venues to have mental health professionals available at large events. They've created a network of support that extends far beyond that one night in Amsterdam. Mike Shinoda, who witnessed that entire event, later said, "That night in Amsterdam was Chester at his absolute best. It was everything good about him distilled into one moment. He saw someone in pain, and he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't keep performing, couldn't keep pretending everything was normal when someone was suffering right in front of him. That was Chester's superpower, his ability to see pain in others and do something about it." The video of Chester stopping the concert has been viewed over 50 million times. In the comments you'll find thousands of stories from people who say it saved their lives, people who saw themselves in Daniel, people who realized they weren't alone in their struggles. But perhaps the most powerful comment comes from Daniel himself, posted on the anniversary of Chester's death. "Chester, if you can somehow see this, I want you to know that I'm still here. I'm still fighting. I'm still turning pain into purpose, just like you taught me. You didn't just save my life that night. You showed me how to save others. Your voice is gone, but your message lives on in every person who chooses to stay, every person who asks for help, every person who realizes that their pain is valid but not permanent. Thank you for stopping the show. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just keep breathing." The tragedy of Chester Bennington's story is that he couldn't apply his own wisdom to himself.
The man who saw Daniel's pain so clearly, who knew exactly how to help a stranger in crisis, couldn't find a way through his own darkness. But the beauty of his legacy is that his moment of compassion, his decision to stop everything and save one life, rippled out into something much larger. Today Daniel is 26 years old. He's married, he's a father, he's a therapist who specializes in working with suicidal teenagers. Every day he helps kids who remind him of himself at 19, standing in that crowd, ready to give up. Chester used to say that music saved his life, Daniel reflects. But that night in Amsterdam, he saved mine, and now I get to save others. It's like this endless chain of people pulling each other back from the edge. Chester started that chain. Even though he couldn't hold on himself, he made sure the chain would continue. The last thing Daniel said in our interview stays with me. People always ask me what I would say to Chester if I could see him again, and my answer is always the same. I would say thank you for stopping the show. Thank you for proving that every life matters, even when it doesn't feel like it. And thank you for showing me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just pay attention to someone who's suffering. You may be gone, but that lesson lives on. And as long as it does, you're still saving lives. The concert in Amsterdam ended that night with Chester and the band playing an acoustic version of Heavy. But they changed the lyrics slightly. Instead of I don't like my mind right now, Chester sang, we don't have to carry this alone right now. Daniel stood on the side of the stage for that final song. No longer the kid who was ready to end everything, but someone who had been reminded that his story wasn't over. That's the real legacy of Chester Bennington. Not just the music, not just the voice, but the reminder that in our darkest moments, someone is watching, someone cares, and someone is willing to stop the world to help us remember that we matter. Chester couldn't save himself, but he saved Daniel, and Daniel has saved hundreds of others, and those people will save hundreds more. The show must go on, but sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop it completely and remind someone that they're not alone. In the end, that might be the most beautiful song Chester Bennington ever sang, the one he performed that night without any music at all, just one human being telling another that their life has value, that their pain is real but not permanent, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just stick around to see what happens next.